now? Okay, doke. Sheila, would you like to open us in prayer?
Sure. Lord, I just thank you that we have this opportunity to come together and study the word. And I just praise you and thank you that you gave us this amazing book that we could learn about you, we could know about you, we could understand who you are and what you've done and what you're planning to do and who we are in relationship to you and what you expect of us, how to get along with others and everything that we need to know, Lord, you provided in your word. And I just praise you and thank you that you are so gracious and so kind to do that. I pray that you'll be with us as we study your word tonight. This is one of my favorite books. I love the way you've given us this picture of what Jesus was going to come to do for us. And just such a warm and loving and amazing picture, Lord. And I just appreciate it so much. I just pray that you will enable us to glean much from tonight and be with Mike and Deepak as they lead our study and be with us as we learn more from your word. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Yes, the word is amazing. And I don't see how you can spend any amount of time in it and not be impressed with its divine author. And yes, Ruth is a particularly wonderful book, and it was designed that way. And in some respects, this may sound weird, but in some respects, Ruth and Jonah remind me of each other. They're not just that they both have just 4 chapters, but the narrative is there's no lag points in it. It just goes. Before you know it, you're out of the book. You're done. Its point is very direct, and both of them are very clear. And so anyway, there's in some of those kinds of respects, Ruth and Jonah remind me of each other. Okay. Well, before we get started in Ruth, remember, Ruth is the preface to the 3rd group of books in the Hebrew Old Testament, Jesus's Bible. We had the law, the prophets, and now the writings. And Ruth stands at the very head of the writings. It is a preface to the writings, and in some respects, it's also a preface to Psalms. But we'll understand why as we go through this. But I think was intended as a preface to the writings as much as it was a preface to the Psalms. And so before we get into Ruth, we want to stop and remind ourselves of this structure of the Old Testament, the Hebrew canon. Whoops, wrong one. Let me share this one with you.
You also need to share it in Zoom.
Yeah, let's
Go to the share screen.
Oh yeah, that's what I was looking for. Okay. Only I just shared the wrong one. Can I put this up and share it also?
But it's only sharing Ruth, so you need to stop the share.
Stop share. Sorry, guys. I'm an absolute rookie at all this. Okay, so you can what I'm doing, this is the overview. You guys have these notes. This is the overview to Jesus's Bible, which means the Hebrew Old Testament canon. And I'm just going over very briefly this section here where it's explained that the divine author of the Old Testament highlighted how the old Mosaic covenant was established, enforced, and enjoyed. And so the first section, so we have is the law. The second section, the first section is the law, and in the law we have the establishing of the old covenant, the Mosaic covenant. The second section is the prophets, and in it the old covenant is enforced. And then the third section is the writings, and in it the old covenant is enjoyed. So just to briefly refresh our memory on that, under the law, the old Mosaic covenant established, the law or Pentateuch is the Bible's first 5 books. And the way that the Pentateuch is laid out, Genesis provides a kingdom prologue that sets the stage for Israel's mission. All right. And then that mission is detailed in Exodus through Deuteronomy. And what I did not write in there, which I should have, is that establishes, it's in this detailing of Israel's mission that the old covenant is established. Remember, in Exodus, the old covenant is given, is established with the nation of Israel. So that's the first section, the law, Genesis through Deuteronomy. The prophets, the second section, is the old Mosaic covenant is enforced. The prophets contain 2 sections. The first one, the former prophets, narrates the history of Israel's covenant failures. And then the second one, the latter prophets give a commentary on the people's rebellion and explains why it went that way. In other words, the former prophets focus on what happened in Israel's downward spiral, and the latter prophets develop why the drama went the way it did. Okay. Then we come to the writings, which is the section that we're starting tonight. And the old covenant enjoyed. And like the prophets, the writings contain 2 main sections, but in reverse order. First commentary, then narrative. So the former writings, which is Ruth through Lamentations, the former writings continue the commentary of the latter prophets. Okay, the commentary was in the prophets, in the latter prophets, was Jeremiah through the 12. And the former writings continue that commentary. And it opens with Ruth, which colors all that follows with messianic anticipation. We'll see that when we get into Ruth. Psalms through Lamentations then clarifies, those books clarify how those hoping in God's kingdom were to live. That is, how they could maintain, and this is key, how they could maintain satisfaction in God amid life's pleasures and pains. So here's the big thing to keep in mind. Here's the big thing to keep in mind, the difference between the prophets and the writings. Remember, the prophets were God's lawyers. his covenant lawyers. And so in the former prophets, they narrate Israel's covenant failures ending in exile. In the commentary section, the latter prophets, they explain why it went that way. That's the focus of the prophets, narrating their covenant failures, explaining why they ended up in exile. Okay? Explaining the destruction of the nation and ending in exile. The writings, the purpose is different. And the writings, the former writings, they are explaining how those few who remain faithful to Yahweh, how they could maintain satisfaction in Yahweh in the midst of life's pleasures and pains. And we'll see that as we go through the former writings. Then the latter writings, Daniel through Second Chronicles, resume the narrative, the historical narrative that was interrupted at the end of Second Kings, the end of the former prophets. All right. And it zooms in Daniel, continues to it details God's preservation of a remnant in exile and the people's initial restoration to the land and the promise of complete kingdom realization. All right. So Daniel in the latter writings details God's preservation of the remnant in exile. Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah narrate the people's initial restoration to the land. And it is First and Second Chronicles, which really is out of chronological order, but for a reason. And when we read First and Second Chronicles, you see it's totally unlike the other, totally unlike First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings. And it's because Chronicles was not written with the same purpose of First and Second Samuel and First and Second Kings. There was a distinct purpose for the way First and Second Chronicles was written, and it narrates the promise of, or it holds out the promise. It narrates Israel's history in a way that holds out the promise of complete kingdom realization. That's why you see the bad stuff left out of, most of the bad stuff left out of First and Second Chronicles, especially the bad stuff regarding in the lives of David and Solomon. You see that left out. And you see so much of First and Second Chronicles taken up with the Davidic lineage, and so on and so forth. That's because First and Second Chronicles is narrating Israel's history with a view to encouraging hope in the promise of complete kingdom realization. So that's why the authors of our textbook say the writings is about the old covenant enjoyed. The writings is particularly aimed at those few who are remaining faithful to Yahweh. The first section, the former writings explaining how they can maintain satisfaction in God in the middle of life's pleasures and pains. And the second section, the latter writings narrating the preservation of the remnant the people's initial restoration and the promise of complete kingdom realization. That's the purpose of the writings. That's what we're getting ourselves into here as we start into Ruth. Any questions about that? All righty. Now let's get on with Ruth. All right. The Book of Ruth. And I'm like Sheila, this is one of my favorites. I love this book. Of course, I say that just about every book I teach. The Book of Ruth is named for its main character, Ruth. And by the way, the meaning of the meaning of the Hebrew word for Ruth is friend. She was a Moabite widow who married the Bethlehemite Boaz. She became an ancestor of King David. We'll see that in chapter 4 of Ruth, toward the end of chapter 4. And thus, because she's an ancestor of King David, that makes her an ancestor of the Messiah. Amazing, isn't it? A Moabite woman is in the lineage of Christ the King. The author of Ruth is never named in the Bible. We don't know who wrote it. According to rabbinic tradition, Samuel is the author. But I don't know what the rabbis were thinking, and they know the whole Testament, the Old Testament, a lot better than I do. But most every commentator you read on Ruth will point out that it's unlikely that Samuel is the author of Ruth because Samuel died before David actually became king. When Samuel died, Saul was still ruling. You remember near the end of Saul's reign, Samuel was dead, and he was desperate to get a word from Samuel. So he went to a necromancer and had her contact Samuel from the dead. Do you remember that? So Samuel was dead before Saul's reign even ended. But Ruth, particularly chapter 4, verses 17 through 22, when it talks about David, when you read that, that implies that David's kingship was an established fact at the time of the writing. And we'll get into that ending in a minute. So that it seems incredibly unlikely that Samuel is the one that wrote it. However, the literary style of Ruth and some of the grammar and the idioms that are used in Ruth point to an author during the monarchy and most likely early on in the monarchy. Okay? So it could have been written during David's lifetime, during his reign, but certainly during the monarchy. Now, as far as the book, the events of the book, the author began his book with the chronological marker in the days when the judges ruled. You see that? You read that in Ruth, the very first verse of Ruth, chapter 1, verse 1. Those words. So, any question about the name of the book and the author of the book? All righty. The scope I didn't want to spend much time telling the scope because Ruth is so short and condensed. If you try to explain the scope of it, you end up explaining the whole story and the whole book. So just brief comments here. Set in the dark days of the period of the judges, the narrative is about two women, Naomi and Ruth, and their experience of redemption through their kinsman, Boaz. The message of the book, however, is much more profound, and we'll get into that. So you remember how dark the book of Judges was, how dark that was. And when we come to the book of Ruth, it's like, whoa, here is a window of what God was doing even during those dark times of the judges. All righty. And then the author provides this table of the big picture view of the content of Ruth. And I love this. In the introduction, Naomi is emptied. And it only takes the introduction 5 verses to show you how empty Ruth is. By the end of verse 5, Naomi. By the end of verse 5, Naomi is in the country of one of Israel's oppressors, Moab, and she is without her husband and without her sons. So in the introduction, Naomi is emptied, and in the body, we get the story of what happened, such that in the conclusion, by chapter 4, verses 13 through 17, Naomi not only is no longer emptied, but she's filled. And then the book ends with the genealogy of David. And the way God fills Naomi is through Ruth and Boaz and their marriage. And we'll get into that. But anyway, that's Ruth at a glance. But I just love that. I just love that view. Naomi emptied at the beginning of the book, at the end of the book, Naomi filled. At the beginning of the book, Naomi herself talks about how God is against her. At the end of the book, Naomi herself is talking about how God has blessed her and shown his favor on her. So anyway, love that picture. Okay, any questions on the scope and big picture view of the content of Ruth?
Quick question about how were the as far as the Moabites, how were the Moabites viewed? Because you said they were oppressors. I actually didn't know that they were, or were they I guess a dimly looked upon group in that time?
Yes, but they weren't allowed. God did not allow the Israelites, when they were conquering the land of Canaan, did not allow them to exterminate the Moabites because they were the Jews' cousins through Lot. The Moabites, and was it the Edomites? No, Edom was Esau. Amorites, yeah. After God rescued Lot and his family from Sodom and Gomorrah before he destroyed them, after that, his daughters had no husbands, no prospects for husbands and all that. He had 2 daughters. And so they got him drunk on a couple of different nights. And the first night, one of them lay with their father. And then the other night, the other one lay with their father. And so they both got pregnant from their father, and Moabites and Amorites came from those two pregnancies. So because they were the Jews' cousins through Lot, God did not allow them to exterminate those peoples. And as a matter of fact, we saw in Ezekiel and Isaiah, I think, at least Isaiah, but I think also in Ezekiel, that God was going to redeem the Moabites and the Amorites as well. They're the two of the nations that he was going to redeem. Good question.
If I could, how do you mean redeem?
Save, both spiritually. He will bring them in to Israel and the church's full salvation, redemption. They will be in the new heaven and the new earth. Is that clear?
Yes,
Or
thank
do
you.
you still have a question about that?
No, that's good.
Okay. Yeah, no. It wasn't that he was just going to save them from the Babylonians and the Persians. He was going to save them spiritually as well. And so that they would be part of the nations, part of the Gentile nations that are included in Messiah's redemption. All right. Okay, then the author of our textbook points out two main key themes in the book of Ruth. The first, the author of Ruth, which we have to say that for sure this time because we don't know who that is other than the divine author. The author of Ruth highlighted covenant faithfulness and Yahweh's gift of a redeemer. And then the other key theme in this book is the author of Ruth emphasized Yahweh's faithfulness to bless the faithful and to fulfill his promises. Okay, let's go through these. So, three main points under this first key theme, the highlighting of covenant faithfulness and Yahweh's gift of a redeemer. First, dwelling in Bethlehem of Judea, they were dwelling, Ruth and her husband, Naomi and her, I'm going to do that throughout the book, aren't I? Naomi and her husband, Elimelech, I think his name was, something like that, were dwelling in Bethlehem of Judah, but they were caught in the middle of a severe famine. And so Elimelech decides to move the family to Moab, and Naomi followed her. The interesting irony here is that Bethlehem, the meaning of the name of the town Bethlehem is house of bread. So Naomi followed her husband away from Bethlehem, the house of bread and the place of redemptive hope, which they didn't know about at that time, but later on it was identified as a place of redemptive hope, into exile within Moab, one of Israel's oppressors. Okay. So they moved away from the house of bread and the place of redemptive hope into exile within the borders of one of Israel's oppressors. That's the geographical, historical setting of the story. Now, they no sooner get there than Naomi's husband died, and so she was left with her two sons. Her sons married Moabite women, Orpah. Sorry about that. Switching of a couple of letters, the order of a couple of letters.
This just became a real interesting story.
I know, and and I've never watched her. Anyway, Orpah and Ruth. Let's see. And where am I? Yes. So we can see that in verses 3-5. So maybe someone wants to read the first 5 verses of chapter 1.
All right. In the days when the judges ruled there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband.
Yeah, so that's what I mean. And the introduction takes only 5 verses to show you how emptied Naomi became. It's very quick and to the point. But we see in the rest of the chapter that Ruth chose to follow Naomi back to Bethlehem. We see that in verse 16. But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." Now, in the next chapter, Boaz is going to fill out her intentions a little bit more. When Ruth made this firm commitment to Naomi, she knew that meant she would remain a single woman without the benefit of male protection or provision. Because her husbands were gone, she's going to go with her mother-in-law back to Bethlehem, and the law in Judah, for the whole nation, was they're not to marry foreigners. So she knew that this meant that she probably was going to remain a widow the rest of her entire life, which meant that at least by the time Naomi died, if not before, she would be without the protection and provision of a husband. Okay. And that was a fearful thing back in that society. Somebody want to read verses 8, 9, and 22 in chapter 2?
Yeah.
Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you're thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." And 22. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It's good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted."
See? So this wasn't a light thing for Ruth to insist that she's going to follow Naomi back to Bethlehem. And her stated I mean, what she told Naomi is, your people will be my people and your God will be my God. Okay. I am going back with you, because that's what she wanted. And so in verse 12, read verse 12. We see more of her intent in that commitment.
The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge.
So this is Boaz speaking. And in light of Ruth's kindness, the kindness of her loyalty to Naomi, Boaz responds with this statement: the Lord repay you for what you have done. And notice he says, he gives a commentary on Ruth's uh, uh, trying to figure out how to state that, a commentary on Ruth's commitment to Naomi. He says that you have come to take refuge in Yahweh, the God of Israel. And so that's what was driving her. This was a very significant thing on her part. So back in chapter 1, the when Ruth, in verse 16, when Ruth made this commitment to Naomi, I think it's legitimate to deduce that in her relationship with Naomi, Ruth saw what this God of Naomi's was like. And she wanted to follow Naomi and take refuge in her relationship with Naomi, Naomi's family, and people, and especially Naomi's God. I don't think that's reading too much into the text to compare 2:12 with 1:16, because this, Orpah, the other widow, she put up some resistance at first to Naomi, and Naomi stressed, you're not going to have anything when you come with me. At least stay with your own people and your own family. But Ruth and Orpah agreed to that. She saw the logic of that and she agreed to that. Ruth, on the other hand, wanted to stay with Naomi and have Naomi's people as her people and Naomi's God as her God. And I think that Boaz puts his finger on Ruth's deepest motivation there. Any questions about that? Okay. God rewarded Ruth by bringing her into the field of Boaz. We've got to see that very clear picture of God's providence. That was as providential as it was as the raising up of Esther in the Book of Esther was. This is a very providential act on God's part. He, remember, is the one who is determining the course of history here. So he leads Ruth into Boaz's field, and that's seen as a reward for her trust in Yahweh, her wanting to take refuge in him. Okay, so let's just work through this. Boaz was the antithesis of the typical man of Judges. He did not abuse his did not abuse his workers, but gently provided for their needs. That was the kind of man that he was. Every time Ruth encountered Boaz, she came to him empty, but left full. He selfishly gave, cared, protected, and redeemed her, all under the umbrella of faithfulness to the covenant of Yahweh. Let's look at that. Let's look at those verses in chapter 2, verse 4, and then 8 and 9 and 14 through 16.
All right. 4. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." And 8 and 9. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young woman. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink where the young men have drawn." And 14 to 16. And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain. And she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her."
Okay, now what verse 4 tells us is that he wasn't just acting that way toward Ruth. He did it toward his other workers. Verse 4, he came from Bethlehem and he spoke those words to the reapers, to all of his workers. "The Lord be with you." And they answered to him, "The Lord bless you." So Boaz was that way to all of his workers. Obviously, we don't have the details of his relationship or his how he acted toward his other workers the way we have with Ruth. But verse 4 shows us he had that gentle, kindly mannerism with his other workers. And then in verse those other 4 verses there about how every time Ruth encountered Boaz, she came to him empty. As Deepak already read, verse 14. He at mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. Notice he had her come and eat with his reapers. He was providing the same sort of thing for his reapers as he provided Ruth in that verse. Verse 17. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah. And you have those other 2 verses, 3:17, 4:13.
Yeah. 17, saying, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law."
So that was Ruth explaining Boaz's words, or relating Boaz's words to Naomi.
Then 4:13, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son.
So each and every time Ruth came to him empty, but left full. That's just the kind of guy he was. And we see in verses 4 and 14 of chapter 2 that he was kind and generous to his other workers as well. Now, in response, we see in that Ruth did not play the part of the foreign temptress, but was a worthy woman. You know, it's interesting. Remember in the wilderness, during Israel's wilderness wanderings, those 40 years, who was it that Balaam had come and camp by the Israelites and tempted them, both sexually as well as with idols, with their idolatry? It was the Moabites. That's very interesting. But in this case, Ruth, a Moabitess, a Moabite widow, did not play the part of the foreign temptress, but was a worthy woman. Here's the point. She was a worthy woman who inspired Boaz to follow the covenant, and in the end brought him honor at the city gate. Look in chapter 3, verse 11. I want you to see this. Let's see. Okay. Okay, we're going to see this later. We're going to go over this later, but look in verse 9. This is when Ruth came after Boaz had gone to sleep. She came in and laid down beside him at his feet, and he answered, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether rich or poor." In other words, she was being very kind to Naomi in that she went after a redeemer of Naomi's family, a close redeemer. And in verse 11, he says, "And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman." Okay, so clearly, before she even went in to Boaz this night, that in chapter 3 here, she already had the reputation amongst the townspeople that she was a worthy woman. She did not play the part of a foreign temptress. And in fact, the point that I want to make here, in this very act of what she's doing here, she is inspiring Boaz to follow the covenant, because this Levirate law is part of the covenant. Deuteronomy 25, Leviticus 25. We find the Levirate marriage laws in that place. And so she was asking, in what she did, she was asking Boaz to fulfill the Levirate laws with respect to Naomi. with respect to Elimelech, actually, Naomi's um, dead husband. And so in that very act, she was inspiring him to follow the covenant. And see, verse 4:11. Do you have that one?
Mhm.
Verse-
Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem."
Okay. Um, um, so that brought him honor at the city gate. Uh, uh, and I'll let you look up those proverb passages as well on your own. So any questions about these first 2 points, especially point B there, what Ruth was doing? Okay. So in response to this, Boaz willingly married Ruth in obedience to the spirit of the law of the levirate marriage. He didn't have to. Notice that the nearest redeemer, the nearest kinsman redeemer, declined to redeem the property because it involved marrying Ruth. And he said it would endanger his own inheritance. And so he declined. So Boaz didn't have to marry Ruth, but in obedience to the spirit of the law, he willingly married Ruth. And in the levirate marriage laws, a man would assume the wife of a deceased relative in order to protect the relative's family and property and to continue that relative's line at great cost to himself. You want to read those?
Oh, Deuteronomy.
Well, I was thinking more of the first 14 verses. Well,
Okay.
yeah, go ahead. Well, I think we have time.
All right. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." And the Redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Now, this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephratah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel.
Boy, his name will be very renowned. In the notes here, after chapter 4, verses 1 through 14, I say Deuteronomy 25, 1 through 5. That should be Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10, not 1 through 5. Okay. So this was an example of the Levirate marriage laws being followed. And Naomi pointed to this principle when she told Ruth, this man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. So you can see that in chapter 2, verse 20, if somebody wants to read that. Ruth had just told her about her first encounter with Boaz.
Verse 20.
Yeah.
Verse 20 says, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, May he be blessed of the Lord, who has not withdrawn his kindness to the living and to the dead. Again, Naomi said to her, The man is our relative. He is one of our closest relatives.
Okay. And it's in the ESV translates it, the man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. So it's the word in there for kinsman redeemer. So a close relative, and the implication there is he can redeem us. He's close enough to be a redeemer. So that was the significance of God bringing Ruth into the field of Boaz. Now, the image of the Redeemer, the kinsman Redeemer, provides part of the background for the work of Jesus, through whom God saved his own from destruction. Somebody want to read Isaiah 54, verses 4 and 5. In Isaiah 53, 4, Isaiah says that the servant, the suffering servant, will redeem us. Notice in Isaiah 54, 4 and 5.
Fear not, for you will not be ashamed. Be not confounded, for you will not be disgraced. For you will forget the shame of your youth and the reproach of your widowhood. You will remember no more. For your Maker is your husband, the Lord of hosts is his name, and the Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. The God of the whole earth he is called.
Yes. So this suffering servant who will be offered up for their sins is the one who redeems them. And notice he will remove the shame of your divorce. Is that what he said in there?
Your widowhood.
Your widowhood. Yes. Your widowhood. So he, in that passage there in Isaiah 54, he's referencing this whole concept of the kinsman redeemer. So what we see Boaz doing, acting as a kinsman redeemer to Naomi's family, is a foreshadowing of what their great-grandson, David, the son of David, David was their great-grandson, the son of David, will do for what David will do for the nation and what the son of David will do for all God's people. Okay. So that's one of the very important concepts to get in the book of Ruth, is this idea of the kinsman redeemer. So any questions there on that part? Again, we were looking at how the author highlighted covenant faithfulness, which we saw in Boaz and Ruth, and Yahweh's gift of a redeemer. Any questions on all of that? No? Okay, the next key theme that the author emphasizes Yahweh's faithfulness to bless the faithful and to fulfill his promises. So regarding the blessing of the faithful, one of the themes you see in the book of Ruth is this calling. Well, let me just read the notes here. The entire book of Ruth calls attention to Yahweh's amazing faithfulness to bless those who remain faithful to him and to fulfill all of his promises. And now here's what I want you to understand here. Here's what I want you to get. Next time you read back through the book of Ruth, look for this. The author intentionally correlates calls for God's blessing in response to covenant faithfulness with details of a positive divine response. Now, let's make that concrete by going through first the example in Ruth's life and then the example in Boaz's life. So we see this pattern in Ruth's life. After the death of her husband and sons, Naomi called on God to bless Ruth for Ruth's kindness, for her kind loyalty to Naomi, the kindness of her loyalty. We see that. We see in chapter 1, verse 8, Naomi calling on God to bless Ruth for the kindness of her loyalty. Somebody want to read that verse?
But Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me."
Okay. So first, Naomi calls for God to bless Ruth for her kindness. Secondly, in reaction to Ruth's self-sacrificing care of her mother-in-law, Boaz called on God to bless Ruth with the full reward. Naomi saw Ruth's kindness. She called on God to bless Ruth. Boaz saw Ruth's kindness to her mother, and he called on God to bless Ruth with a full reward. Chapter 2, verse 13. Somebody got that?
I don't think that's Boaz. That's the next one. I think we're looking for verse 12. See how we have 13 in there twice?
Oh, yeah, okay. So that should be 2:12.
Boaz says, "The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge."
Yes. Okay. So, in Ruth's life, we have Naomi and Boaz both calling on God to bless Ruth because of her kindness to Naomi. So, in turn, we read Ruth found favor in the eyes of Boaz, enjoyed provision from his hand, and received his protective care as a husband and enjoyed the blessing of a child. So what's happening here, what I want you to see here is the author is correlating this favor of God on Ruth, God's blessing on Ruth. He's correlating that with Naomi's call on God to bless her and Boaz's call on God to bless her. You want to read those three verses, 2:13, 3:17, and 4:13?
All right. 2:13. Then she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I'm not one of your servants.
She was talking to Boaz, by the way.
And then 3:17, saying, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. And then 4:13, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son.
Yes. Okay, so we see this pattern in Ruth's life. She acts, even though she's not an Israelite, she's a foreigner, she's a Moabite, she acts toward Naomi and towards Boaz also. The way she acted toward Boaz, she acted according to what the covenant, the old covenant would require. And so we see Naomi and Boaz both calling on God to bless her, and he did it. So that's an example of Yahweh's faithfulness to bless the faithful. Okay, and we see a similar pattern in the life of Boaz. After his initial care for Ruth, Naomi prayed for God's, and I left out the word blessing, on Boaz in chapter 2, verse 20. You want to read that again?
Yeah. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Naomi also said to her, the man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers.
Yes, so here we have Boaz being faithful to the covenant, acting, treating his workers the way the old covenant calls on people, on the Israelites to treat their workers. And in response to that, Naomi is prays for God's blessing on Boaz. And of course, Naomi has no idea of just how greatly God would bless Boaz. Because we find out at the end of the book that through Boaz's and Ruth's offspring would come David. Naomi just saw Obed, okay, which was the son of Boaz and Ruth. She had no idea that Obed's grandson was going to be David, and that ultimately Messiah, Jesus, would come from David's line. Okay, so again, same pattern. Boaz acting the way God calls his people, living the way God calls his people to live. Naomi sees it as it impacts her, and she prays for God's blessing on Boaz. And the author of Ruth details for us God's answer to that prayer. So again, you can see how he's correlating calls for blessing on a person for their covenant faithfulness with details of God's response to those calls for blessing. Look at Matthew. This was the ultimate answer to Naomi's prayer. She thought Obed was, but this was the ultimate answer to Naomi's prayer. You want to read those verses?
Yeah. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And then verse 5. And
Yes.
Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king, and David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. And then 16. And Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who's called Christ.
Right. So Ruth and Boaz are mentioned right there in the genealogy of Messiah. It did mention Boaz, didn't it?
Mhm.
Yeah. And so Naomi had no idea regarding the ultimate answer to her prayer. And so any questions about this principle here, or this theme of God, Yahweh blessing the faithful? None? Okay, must be real clear. Now, also, the author in the process is emphasizing the fulfilling of Yahweh fulfilling his promises. So got a little bit more to say about this. Significantly, upon Boaz's declaration of intent to marry Ruth, in chapter 4, we're in chapter 4 here, upon Boaz's declaration of intent to marry Ruth, the residents of Bethlehem prayed this in verse 11 of chapter 4. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. That was very significant, them saying that, which was routine. I mean, it was ritual, but the author of Ruth is recording this for a point. Historically, this proclamation made by the residents of Bethlehem came before the nation's destruction in exile. But remember, Ruth is placed at the beginning of the writings. So Ruth, the book of Ruth, is placed after the prophets. The prophets is a section that deals with Israel's covenant failure and their destruction in exile. Ruth is placed in the canon after the prophets, and so the placement of Ruth there allow these words of the residents of Bethlehem to cast hope for the full restoration of God's people. That's the significance behind the placement of Ruth in the Hebrew canon. And then right along with that, Boaz's and Ruth's son Obed was the grandfather of David, and David is the Old Testament's royal image of hope. And I've got the author provides a whole stream Old Testament passages to show this, how abundantly and consistently David is presented as the Old Testament's royal image of hope. So the point here is that the effect of this statement after the prophets are already past, this statement at the beginning of the writings casts or colors the writings with hope, because that's what Ruth does. Ruth ends in a great statement of hope here. And so it sets the context for the rest of the writings. And it sets that context after the prophets, which narrated and explained the reason for Israel's decline all the way to destruction and exile. Any questions regarding that? Why don't you read chapter 4, those two verses, verses 17 and 22.
All right. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son had been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And 22, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David.
Yes. And then you could just start with 2 Samuel 7 and read the rest of those passages. Let's see. I'm just going to pick a couple here. First, Amos, chapter 9. This is the passage that James quotes in Acts 15 at the Jerusalem Council and applies to Jesus. Verses 11 and 12.
In that day I will rise up the booth of David that's fallen, and repair its breaches, and raise up its ruins, and rebuild it as in the days of old, that they may possess the remnant of Edom, and all the nations who are called by my name, declares the Lord who does this.
Okay, the booth of David is fallen. The house of David is in ruins, and he's going to raise it up in the latter days. And Israel was God's people were very keyed into this concept here, this image of David being, or this concept of David being the royal image of hope. And you can see that here in this verse, and in Acts 15, James even brings up this verse and quotes it. So that was very prominent in the hope and thinking of the Israelites. And then, in contrast to Judges, the book of Ruth finished with the promise of new life and had David as its final word. You can see that in chapter 4, verse 22. Go ahead.
Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David.
Yeah, that's the final word in the book of Ruth. It ends with the word David. And that was designed, specifically, intentionally designed by the author to stimulate the reader's imagination, to stimulate it in this direction. David would do on a national level what Boaz has done on a personal one. That was the author's intention by finishing the book of Ruth with the promise of new life and having David as its final word. He is emphasizing here, the author is emphasizing Yahweh's commitment to fulfilling his promise. And David is being held out there as the great hope. Now, remember, the author, whoever wrote this book, was living during the times of the monarchy. Okay. And so when this author put together the Book of Ruth, he was deliberately structuring the Book of Ruth in this way, and this ending, the way the Book of Ruth ends, verses 17 through 22, was designed to encourage the people of Yahweh regarding God's fulfillment of his promises, and to give them hope, to reassure them. Okay. The same godliness that drove Boaz would drive David to bless his nation and redeem their lives from the moral chaos of the judges. And isn't that what we see in the life of David? You think of 2 Samuel, the way the life of David is described, and also in First Chronicles. And you think of the Psalms that David wrote, and you can see that. You can see what's going on inside him. Think of Psalm 119, how David loved the Torah and meditated on it all the time. And so we see that we see that godliness of David that drove him to bless his nation and to redeem the people's lives from the moral chaos of the judges. All right. And you can see it even in David's decline. Remember, in First Kings, his conversation with Solomon and his encouragement to do what the kings are supposed to do, and that is to take Deuteronomy and write it down, make their personal copy of it, have it approved by the priests, and meditate on it day and night. David encouraged Solomon to do this. All of that drive was to bless the nation, to see the nation blessed, and to see the people of Israel redeemed from the moral chaos that they experienced in the period of the judges. And also, you see that same fact highlighted in that 10-person genealogy at the end of the book. You want to read that genealogy there?
Uh-huh. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Aminadab. Aminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David.
Now, the author wasn't just following up an exciting story with a boring genealogy. He had a point with ending this book with this genealogy. First of all, this genealogy would recall in the Israelites' minds the 10-person genealogy of Genesis 5 and the 9-person genealogy of Genesis of 11. And both of those genealogies in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11 focus on the line of promise. Seth's line in Genesis 5 and the line that led up to Abraham in Genesis 11. So both of those genealogies in Genesis focus on the line of promise. The author of Ruth begins his 10-person genealogy with Perez. Perez was included in that 9-person genealogy in Genesis 11. And Perez was the grandson of Jacob and the son of Judah. He was the grandson of Jacob and the son of Judah and Tamar. And if you go back into Genesis 38 and read that story, you see that Perez's own study own story involved the institution of the Levirate marriage. You read the story of Judah and Tamar. That's the birth of Perez. And Perez, taken from this patriarchal genealogy in Genesis 11, is the beginning of the genealogy here at the end of Ruth. And the point of it, the link with the patriarchal narratives in general and Judah in particular, highlighted God's promise of a royal deliverer who would ultimately set all things right. Genesis 22, 17 and 18, and then 49, 8 through 10.
All right. I'll surely bless you and I'll surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that's on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice.
Okay, well, he's turning to chapter 49. That was Yahweh, that was God speaking, that was El Shaddai speaking to Abraham. And now we've already seen in the book of Genesis that this same promise was reaffirmed to Isaac and then Jacob. And so now see Jacob's words to Judah in particular.
Judah, your brother shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's son shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. You stooped down, he crouched as a lion. And as a lioness, who dares rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples.
Okay, see that last statement there in verse 10, the scepter shall not depart from his feet, and the obedience of the people will be to him. So again, the author of Ruth, by constructing this genealogy at the end, he was linking it with the patriarchal narratives in general and Judah in particular. And the reason for him doing that was to highlight God's promise of a royal deliverer who would ultimately set things right. And so then he ended the genealogy as well as the book with the name of David, which is the Old Testament's royal image of hope. So you can see what the author is doing here. Very cleverly done. And And then just to finish this out, Yahweh had redeemed the ancestors of David from their temporary exile in Moab. I'm referring to Elimelech and Naomi and their family. The ancestor of the ancestors of David was Boaz and Ruth. Okay, that's the story of Ruth, how Boaz and Ruth became the ancestors of David. So anyway, Yahweh had redeemed the ancestors of David from their temporary exile in Moab, and he would do so again for those under Persian rule. And he would raise up the promised son of David and would through him redeem and restore. The story of Ruth, therefore, provides a hope-filled analogy for those living apart from the complete fulfillment of the restoration promises. And that tells you exactly why Ruth was placed in the Hebrew canon at the beginning of the writings as a preface to the writings, to color after the darkness of the prophets, to color the writings with hope. And so the author concludes that with these sentences. He says, placed within its biblical context, the Book of Ruth is clearly more than a story of the salvation of Naomi's family line. It was not less than that, but it was clearly much more than that. In nearly every way, the story of Ruth contrasts and answers the message of Judges, and therefore provides a helpful prelude to the hope of the writings. After the extended testimony in the prophets to the ominous chaos in Israel and the nations, the book of Ruth provides great encouragement by disclosing to us that a remnant faithful to Yahweh did exist, and that God was in the process of fulfilling the Davidic promises. That's the whole point of the book of Ruth. So, any questions over that? Any questions over what we've gone over in the book of Ruth?
Mike,
Yes.
you went through, I got called away, so I'm not sure you covered this, but in Isaiah 54, you mentioned the kinsman redeemer appears there. And I was just thinking today, I woke up to the reading of Ruth. Anyway,
Oh, great.
I got clear through it, slept through most of it, but the thought occurred to me is the thing that I love most, and I agree with Sheila. It's the greatest book in the Bible. But I woke up to the thought that I did get something out of me when I was sleeping. The kinsman redeemer. I need a redeemer.
Yes.
That's one of the most precious to me aspects of my salvation. Is God purposed went into the mass of Christianity, of the lost, and particularly went after me as a redeemer. He redeemed me out of that mess. So I like that. But I was thinking kinsman redeemer. Obviously, we know from other scriptures that Jesus is the kinsman redeemer. But how so? I was an enemy of his, not a kinsman. And I know the Bible's clear about that, Revelation 5:9 you've covered and so forth. But what do you, and then you got that out of Isaiah 54, although I don't think Isaiah 54 said anything about kinsmen, did it?
I
Phil,
think
I'm going to jump in because this is one of my favorite parts of Ruth. Um, it- this is the reason Christ had to come in human form. He had to incarnate because he had to be a man in order to be a kinsman.
Yes.
In order to be a kinsman redeemer, he had to be a man. And it's just like, when I read this book, I mean, the kinsman redeemer, the inheritance, we're talking about the Levirate marriage and the inheritance, but think of it. Our parents died spiritually. We were supposed to be gods from the beginning, right? But they died spiritually and they broke that lineage, and we are Christ's inheritance. So he's our kinsman redeemer, and he came to retrieve his inheritance. I mean, it's just like this book, the language so beautifully just describes everything that Christ did and makes it so clear that this was God's plan all along from the beginning. It wasn't like we messed up and he had to come up with a fix, right? It was the plan from the beginning. And this book to me just makes it so clear. And I agree with you too, Mike, about Jonah, because it's all about, 3 days in the belly of the whale, right? And then he's resurrected. Then the Ninevites, the worst people on the planet, and he's going to save them, right? This Moabitess, right? Not only does he redeem her, but she's in the lineage of Christ. I mean, it just shows that God is not partial to persons, right? He has a plan, and he's working out his plan, and we are so blessed that he's included us in it.
Yes, thank you so much for jumping in. You stated that so eloquently. I was going to take us to Hebrews chapter 2, verse 14, which just hangs a verse on what Sheila was saying. Hebrews 2:14 says, "Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he, Jesus himself, likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil." That's the way he became our kinsman and redeemer, because we share in flesh and blood. He himself partook of the same.
So in that way, what she was saying is, it doesn't give me any credit because I can't say Jesus is my homeboy. He's not my kinsman in that sense.
No.
But he became human. I like that. Thanks, Sheila. That's really good. By the way, 29 generations, I counted them, from Ruth to Messiah. Maybe you said that, Mike.
I didn't say 29.
So here it goes. Great, 29 times, and you get to Jesus.
Or at least 27 greats. Yes.
Well, one is a mother, so you have to do, it's probably 27 or 28.
And then a great. Then you start with the greats.
Yeah, that's true.
You're right.
And because it's 14 generations from Abraham to David to the exiles, 14, and then 14 to Messiah. And I got it. That was an easy arithmetic problem. Anyway, it was,
Well, just one last thing before we stop the recording, and then we can continue talking. Just to hang a verse again on what Sheila was saying about Jonah. I love the way the book of Jonah ends. Verse 11, Jonah 4:11. This is God talking to Jonah. "And should not I pity Nineveh, that great city, in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also much cattle?" And that's the way the book of Jonah ends. Jonah didn't want God to show mercy on the Ninevites because, like Sheila said, they were the worst people on earth. They were feared. And so that's why he ran, but God didn't let him get away. I loved God's explanation. Him, shouldn't I pity them? There are more than 120,000 persons, and also much cattle. You know, he was also concerned about the cattle as well as people. So anyway, Jonah extraordinarily highlights God's mercy and loving kindness. And that's also what Ruth highlights. So let's, Philip, would you mind closing us in prayer? Then we'll stop the recording.
I would love to, Mike. I got drawn away 2 or 3 times, so maybe somebody who was there for the whole session should pray. I can pray. But...
Sure. You want to pray for us?
Sure. Heavenly Father, thank you for the Book of Ruth and what we learned about what you've done for us through this book. Thank you that this is not just a story about a family living in the ancient Middle East, but this is the story of us and how we were all just like Ruth and Naomi without much prospects, but you sent your son as the Redeemer to save us. And thank you for that. And I pray that we would live that out as we go about our week, that we rely on our Redeemer to do what you called us to do. That's called this.
Amen.
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 Amen. Amen.